Good morning, good afternoon to this official BETD side event. It's the week of the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue, and we are hosting the Global Steel at the Crossroads webinar today. Why the global steel sector has to invest in climate neutral technologies in the 2020s. I'm Nicola Bock. I'm head of events at Agora Energiewende, and we have 1 hour now to learn more about why the global steel sector has to invest in climate neutral technologies in the 2020s. And in order to moderate this event, the next 60 minutes, I'm happy to ask my colleague Oliver Sator, who is Senior Advisor for Industry at Agora Energiewende, to introduce himself and also lead us through this webinar the next 60 hours. Looking forward to interesting insights. Over to you, Ollie.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and thank you to everyone for being here. My name is Oliver Sator, as Nicola said. I'm Senior Advisor for Industry at Agora Industry. This promises to be a very interesting event on the subject of global steel at the crossroads, why the global steel industry needs to invest in the 2020s. Why are we having this event? Well, partly because the global steel sector does appear to be at the crossroads. We have, as our speakers will explain later, we have a critical investment cycle coming up in the next 10 to 15 years for the transition to climate neutral steel globally. And this is therefore becoming an important topic for our efforts to achieve the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. We also see there's growing momentum in the steel sector. We saw, for example, at COP26, the Steel Breakthroughs Initiative was launched. We see other initiatives developing as well, such as emission innovation, responsible steel, the EU-US Global Steel and Aluminium Agreement, discussions around international climate clubs that might focus on steel in part, etc. So, and we also see many companies now making, the first announcements in a way to develop ultra low carbon steel production technologies, or to purchase low carbon steel for their production of certain products. So in this context, we wanted very much to bring together a distinguished panel of guests, yourselves in the audience, to share perspectives on this transition from different countries around the world, to better understand what the challenges are, what the solutions are, and what needs to happen in the short term to really kickstart this transition properly. And so we wanted to take this occasion of the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogues and the side event to do so. I will hand over in a minute to our speakers, but maybe just to give you a rundown of the structure of this event, we will start with 10 minutes of a presentation from Vito Viteca here at Agora Industry, providing sort of an overview of how Agora sees this question of the global steel transformation. We'll then hear from guests, from 5 guests we have from key countries around the world for this transition, including Australia, Japan, Korea, South Africa, and Sweden, to get their perspectives on this transition. And then after that, we will hand over for comments and questions from the audience. We have 1 hour, so I'll keep it brief, and perhaps without further ado, I'll ask Vito to share his slides and to kickstart the event. Thank you, Vito.
Yes, thank you, Oliver, for this introduction, and a warm welcome also from my side. My name is Vito Viteca. I work for Agora Industry, a sub-brand of the Berlin-based think tank Agora Energiewende. I will give a brief input about a study that we published last year in November at COP. It is entitled Global Steel at a Crossroads. The global steel sector is at a crossroads, and there are two reasons for that. The first reason is that before 2030, more than 70% of the existing coal-based blast furnace capacity will reach the end of their working life and require major reinvestments. Each of these reinvestment windows will be a decision for the companies, but also for governments and the jobs affected, whether these companies choose to reinvest into coal-based technologies, which will lock in emissions for the coming decades, or whether they opt to invest in technologies that are compatible with climate neutrality. Apart from the existing global blast furnace fleet, we also have countries with rapidly rising steel demand, such as India or Southeast Asia. And to satisfy this domestic steel demand, these countries are currently planning to build a lot of new coal-based blast furnace capacity. So we're in a decade where this juncture will be reached and where decisions have to be taken, which road to take for the next decades. Why is that so important? It is important because steel making assets have very long lifetimes. And that's why the investment decisions in the 2020s will be crucial. For a blast furnace relining, which basically means that an existing blast furnace reaches the end of its campaign life and needs to be replaced with some additional investment for refurbishment, this would add another 15 to 20 years. So if we assume such a blast furnace relining in 2025, the next blast furnace campaign would last until 2040 or 2045. When it comes to building new steel works, the lifetime of such a new steel plant in India or in Southeast Asia, for example, is up to 50 years. And you can see here, some of this could also be in conflict with the announcements to achieve net zero targets by the different countries. And there's a big risk for stranded assets. The good news is that key low carbon steelmaking technologies are ready to be deployed now, and the project pipeline of announcements to build them before 2030 is growing rapidly. Basically, as you can see here, it's about two technologies: direct reduced iron. Everyone talks about hydrogen-based steelmaking. It is this technology. Initially, it can also be operated with natural gas, and then without any retrofit, you can blend in increasing shares of clean hydrogen. So not all of these plants here may be operating on green hydrogen from the very start, but there's no risk of carbon lock-in with this technology. And then we also have another technology, a switch to secondary steelmaking by replacing blast furnaces with electric arc furnaces. You can also see on the right-hand side, there are already quite a number of announcements when these first DRI plants, commercial scale DRI plants, can go online. And we can see from the announcements of the companies that they think the technology is ready. Another really interesting fact is that currently, no steel company worldwide is working on the commercialization of CCS on coal-based blast furnaces. And this means that if retroactive CCS does not materialize in the future, and there's a risk of that if no company is working on that, reinvesting into blast furnaces in the 2020s may be a dead-end road. I mentioned already the risk of stranded assets. If there's one picture to describe the challenge of the global steel sector in the 2020s, it is what you see here on the left-hand side. This enormous amount of blast furnace capacity that needs to be reinvested, 1,091 million tons. And we're currently seeing the first announcements to replace them with green steel. So basically, we have already announcements of 62 million tons to build DRI capacity. We assume that a switch to secondary steel above 100 million tons is possible. It could also be much higher. And then a shutdown of overcapacity without replacement. But what we also see is that for a large chunk, and we call it the 2020s transformation gap, there are no transformation plans, which would mean that by default, probably the steel companies would reinvest into coal-based blast furnaces and lock these emissions in. And you can also translate these findings into job effects. And that's what you see on the right-hand side, that some jobs are transitioned to clean and future-proof jobs, but the majority will still be linked to coal-based production processes. If we look at one of the front-runner regions worldwide, it's worth to take a look at the EU. In the EU, most blast furnaces that reach the end of their campaign life by 2030 will be replaced with low-carbon technologies. So you see on the left-hand side, again, the same picture for the EU. 70 million tons of blast furnace capacity will reach the end of their campaign life before 2030. But we already have announcements by EU steel companies to replace 50 million tons, 37 million tons of DRI capacity and 13 million tons a switch to secondary steel making, to replace the majority of these blast furnaces that reach the end of their lifetime with these kilo carbon technologies. And I'm also confident that we'll get close to closing the 2020s transformation gap, so that in the EU we won't see many blast furnace relinings anymore. What is the reason for that? Well, it's the Fit for 55 package by the EU Commission that is proposed, and that's why companies understand that they now have to start to invest into these kilo carbon technologies. At the same time, we need to say that final investment decisions have not been taken so far for many of these technologies. So we still need to make sure that with policy instruments such as carbon contracts for difference, but also demand side policies to create lead markets, we get those final investment decisions in the EU. So as a conclusion, the global steel transformation needs to start in the 2020s. The kilo carbon technologies are ready and can be deployed now. As of now, it seems that DRI is the only kilo carbon technology to decarbonize primary steel making that will be available in the 2020s. And there are a couple of challenges. I didn't touch upon them in greater detail today, but maybe we will hear about them in the panel discussion. So high-grade iron ore qualities, clean hydrogen supply, an increase of the DRI engineering capacity, and policy instruments to bridge the cost gap will be needed. Aligning the steel sector with a 1.5 degrees compatible scenario needs to put the asset transition from coal to clean at its core. In our view, the best strategy is to avoid reinvestments into new blast furnaces by prolonging the lifetimes of existing ones by 2 to 5 years, and then after 2025, invest into DRI directly. For advanced economies, this means that all blast furnaces that reach the end of their lifetime should be replaced with a technology that is compatible with climate neutrality. Just to give you one comparison, the EU and also the US are planning to phase out coal in the power sector by the early 2030s, and by then each blast furnace would be the highest emitter. Of course, we are here at the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue, and it's very important to have a single speed global steel transformation. That means that all countries start moving at the same time. This would be tremendously helpful to bring enhanced international cooperation and the level playing field. And also the transformation will help to transition millions of workers to clean and future-proof jobs. If you're interested in our report and also like our web tool, the Global Steel Transformation Tracker, you'll find them on our website. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to the panel discussion and the panelists. Back to you, Ali.
Thank you very much, Vito, for a very clear and interesting overview. We now have a roundtable with some experts from 5 different countries on their national steel sectors. So I'll invite our panelists to turn on their cameras so we can all see you. We're going to hear from Rachel Eun-ko, who's Director of Industrial Decarbonisation Program at Next Group in Korea, from Tim Buckley, Director of Climate Energy Finance in Australia, from Yuko Nishida, who's Senior Manager for the Renewable Energy Institute in Japan, from Max Arman, who's Associate Professor at Lund University in Sweden, and from Hilton Trollope, Research Fellow, Global Risk Governance Program at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. The purpose of this panel is just to hear really from each of you a little bit about the state of play of the steel sector transition to low carbon technologies in your country, to understand first which projects might be already announced or might be happening in the next 10 years, and also to understand where policy is at the moment, if governments are putting in place the policies to enable those investments to happen. So perhaps without further ado, I can ask just for 2 to 3 minutes from each of you, starting with Rachel Eun-ko. Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Oliver. All right. Well, in Korea, there are two steelmakers that operate blast furnaces, which is POSCO and Hyundai Steel. And their long-term strategy for transformation is hydrogen DRI, which they aim to pilot by 2030 and commercialize before 2040. So the problem with that is that there are not enough short-term strategy to cut emissions before 2040. And what's being discussed now are so-called bridge technologies, which help the existing blast furnaces cut emissions by injecting more coke oven gases to replace a portion of cokes and increasing inputs of scrap steel. So these so-called bridge technologies will not cut more than 10% of the current emission level and keep blast furnaces running for another 15 years. So in Korea, around like 51% of blast furnaces will reach the end of its working lifetime before 2030. And it is expected that these blast furnaces will run for another reinvestment cycle only with bridge technologies. And very recently, POSCO rolled back its 2030 emission target from 30% cut to 10% cut, admitting that 30% cut will be an unrealistic target. However, there's one possible project option beside bridge technologies. Last month, POSCO signed an agreement with an Australian mining company, Hancock, to produce H2 hydrogen DRI using hydrogen in Australia, where hydrogen is much more economic than Korea. So this DRI will be shipped over to Korea to be further processed in electric arc furnaces, which will be in operation by 2027. So if this structure proves feasible, the DRI part will be like in the Korean steel making value chain. The DRI part will be shifted to Australia, and the final processing will remain in Korea. That's one possible option in the short term. There are no government measures in support of steel transformation right now, but except for R&D support. So this is, well, I personally think that this is why Korean steel industry is not incentivized to do more beyond R&D. We have been running the KETS for the last 6 years, but the steel sector is eligible for 100% free allocation. And for the last 6 years, steelmakers didn't pay a dime for their emissions, which are equivalent to 10% of the overall national emissions. So in terms of cost, steelmakers have no reason, like no economic reason to replace their blast furnaces right now. So Next Group firmly believes that what has to be done really most urgently in Korea is to reinforce, like KETS to make blast furnaces an economic option. So that's sort of the state of play in Korea. Thank you.
Excellent, Rachel. Very, very, very clear presentation. Thank you for this very, very clear breakdown. Sounds like there are there's a fair bit of conservatism still, but maybe some sort of green shoots with this new deal between POSCO and Hancock in Australia. I might then hand over just indeed to Tim Buckley, Director of Climate Energy Finance in Australia, to talk about Australia in that case. Tim.
Thanks, Oliver, and good evening from Sydney. I'll note that Australia is far from a leader in decarbonising its steel manufacturing, and steel manufacturing is just 0.3% of global production from Australia. So we're a very small player. And further, Australia's largest steel manufacturer is a company called BlueScope, and it's very much a slow follower globally. It's targeting just a 1% annual emissions reduction target by 2030. And they are at the same time considering a 20-year blast furnace extension later this decade. So exactly as Guido warned, this is a multi-decade emissions lock-in risk. And it really comes down to the lack of ambition in the Australian federal government's commitment to net zero emissions. It's absolutely lukewarm at best, and there is no financial incentives, as Rachel was highlighting. So you might then wonder why I'm commenting on this seminar about the critical importance of global steel industry decarbonisation. But the answer is that Australia does play an absolutely key global role in the steel supply chain. We are #1 exporter of iron ore in the world. We're also the #1 exporter of coking coal in the world. So Australia will play a major role. Australia supplies 38% of the world's iron ore trade, 55% of the world's coking coal trade. So one way or the other, we will be a major player. Both BHP and Rio, our two largest iron ore players, have both made net zero emissions commitments by 2050, but they're primarily playing, like BlueScope, a slow follower role. They're too busy profiteering from unprocessed iron ore and coking coal exports to worry about decarbonisation while we have a lack of federal government policy. But I will finish on a comment that Australia does have some very, very good industrial ambition. So I'll centre my comments on Fortescue Metals Group, who in May 2021 committed to net zero emissions on a Scope 1 and Scope 2 basis by 2030 and net zero on Scope 3 by 2040. Now, Fortescue is our third largest iron ore player in Australia, and Fortescue is absolutely leading Australia's heavy industry decarbonisation pressures. Fortescue at the moment is spending something like $500 million a year on decarbonisation across their business. So to give them a shout out, I do that in the context that BlueScope, BHP and Rio are not leaders, whereas Fortescue really is actually putting their money on the line here. And you would have seen as a huge kudos to Germany as well, Fortescue reached an absolute highlight this week, signing a 28 million tonne per annum green ammonia supply agreement with E.ON of Germany. And I know that's not directly tied to the steel industry. It highlights how the global themes of energy security and decarbonisation can be entirely aligned, and how Germany is playing an absolutely key role in that. So I'd emphasise that there are some very positive signs coming through. And I'll finish just by saying, as Rachel highlighted about the Hancock-POSCO deal, one of the key potential areas for Fortescue is green iron. We haven't seen a lot of technical detail. We haven't seen any public announcements, but when the company is spending $500 million a year on research, technology development and deployment, I am very hopeful that Australia could go from being the world's largest exporter of iron ore and coking coal to actually being the world's largest exporter of green iron. But we need the price signal, as Rachel said, whether that's in Japan and Korea or whether that's coming from Australian pressure. And at the moment, we don't have the political mandate. But I'll stop there and hand back to you, Oliver.
Excellent, Tim. So very interesting. It sounds like, as you say, the policy framework's not quite there, but there's an enormous economic potential that's just in a way waiting for someone to create the policy framework to sort of exploit, right? And whoever does that first might actually start to tip things into the right direction. With that, I might hand over so thank you, Tim. I might hand over then to Yuko Nishida, Senior Manager, Renewable Energy Institute from Japan, for a perspective from Japan.
Yeah, Japan. So in Japan, currently there are more than 80 million tons capacity of blast furnaces, and about 80% of them is reinvestment. to renovate by 2030, which is more than the global average described by Vito. So utilizing this reinvestment opportunity as the key for the early decarbonization, of course. But the steel companies, that it's major one, three, and the government seems to put the priority to keep blast furnaces, and now conducting R&D to utilizing the blast furnaces by using hydrogen and adding CCS. This is, I think, the risky pathway, but they plan the actual production by 2030, but just for one plant. Another technology pathway is direct reduction using 100% hydrogen, but this will not be fully developed by 2030, except one company which already has the Midrex technology, so they might use that. Also, new large-scale electric furnaces are announced to be introduced by 2030. But regardless of these pathways, the large and low-cost supply of renewable electricity and green hydrogen are the key, and also the big challenge in Japan. So as for the policy, the setting the 2050 and 2030 climate target was very important, but and the government has been providing the funds to especially R&D to support technology development. In particular, starting from 2021, 10-year 200 billion yen, means 1.7 billion euro fund will be attached. For promoting transition finance, the roadmap for steel industry decarbonization has established in the government committee. But on the other hand, the effective level of carbon pricing has not yet been introduced in Japan. So it's really a challenge to ensure the target realization. For example, the Japan Federation of Steel and Iron and Steel published their target, 30% reduction by 2030 and carbon neutral by 2050. But to ensure the target realization or to incentivize the early movers, and also to strengthen the financial basis for support, those things are really difficult without the carbon pricing, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuko. So interesting. So it sounds like sort of, yes, some elements of the framework emerging with sort of these overarching targets and some, you know, meaningful amounts of funding now starting to be provided, but still some missing incentives to go a bit faster. Thank you very much, Yuko. Next, we have Max Arman, who's Associate Professor at Lund University in Sweden. Max, can you give us a Swedish perspective, please?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. And it's always a pleasure to present the Swedish case in these kind of cases, because it's actually quite a nice one. In 2016, the major steel company, iron ore company, and electric utility went together and formed a consortium called Hybrid to develop the first world's fossil-free value chain. Today, 2022, they have already piloted and actually started producing the various parts of this value chain at different sites to make it technical feasible. And I just want to sort of show, I was given this from Hybrid. It's allegedly the first hot briquetted iron produced from one of the first batches of fossil-free iron. So it's for real. It looks exactly the same as it would have if it were produced by fossil fuels, but nonetheless. But from then on, the Hybrid Consortium recently got funded from the EU as well to go to scale up. And by 2025, they aim to be ready with a demonstration plant of 1.3 megatons of steel per year, start selling fossil-free steel in a full value chain 2026. However, they also got competition within Sweden now, and there is a newcomer startup in the heavy industry segment, which is not that often you see, H2 Green Steel, that aims to be ready by 2024. It's a very ambitious plan, and I'm not fully convinced they will make it by 2024, but hopefully soon thereafter. And they aim to produce 2 million tons of fossil-free steel by 2025 or 24, but half of that will be based on scrap. Things have been moving quite fast in Sweden, as you have understood, due to very good access to renewable electricity, good potentials, and a strong belief that this is the right way to go. SSAB had originally the plan of being fossil-free in their completely own 3 sites with blast furnaces today by 2020-45. Recently, a couple of months ago, they shortened that time frame and said they will be fossil-free by 2030, basically closing the remaining blast furnaces by 2030 already. LKAB, that roughly produces around 25 million tons of iron ore pellets, whereof 5 million tons goes to Scandinavia and is made out of steel here, said that the rest of that they aim to reduce all, by 2040, reduce all of their iron ore to DRI and, well, these kind of things up at the mine, and export iron instead of green iron instead of iron pellets, iron ore pellets. So I mean, and that's by 2040, and I mean it's a directionality target. It's not investment target, but that goes to show sort of the speed happening right now in Sweden. And why is this happening? Policy. Well, first, today it's easy to point at the EU ETS and say that it's basically profitable with today's ETS prices. But I should also like to remind you, when these decisions were taken the first time, the outlook of the EU ETS prices were very low, even the long term. And I think it has to do more with those targets, with the directionality and a convincement that government will not be slack on this long-term target. There was a strong commitment to net zero target 2050, and some of these companies had big reinvestment needs. And then, of course, they had to make a choice, either reinvest in fossil or reinvest in fossil-free. And in that sense, that was easy. There is also a question that there is a huge potential for renewable electricity at very competitive prices in Scandinavia that would also make this easier for them. Since then, the EU ETS price has risen, and of course, giving even further motivation to this. Also, the EU, as I said, the Innovation Fund will now help fund the demonstration project. The Energy Agency has funded the pilot projects, not completely, but at least around 30 to 40%, roughly, I guess. So there has been ample funding as well. So, well, a lot of things are happening in Sweden. Some have already materialized. The rest we hope to see in the coming years if everything goes as planned. Thank you.
Wow, Max, so extremely ambitious things happening in Sweden and actually sounding very credible as well. Even if we can question some of the timelines, the overall transition seems to be moving, very seriously for some of these companies in Sweden and Scandinavia. I'm aware we're a little bit behind time, so I'll thank you, Max, and we hand over directly to Hilton Trollope from University of Cape Town in South Africa.
Thanks, Oliver, and good morning, everybody. South Africa is quite different from the other countries talked about so far, mainly in terms of the size of the economy and also the levels of unemployment, which are 35%, formal unemployment, and levels of poverty and inequality. As far as the legacy iron and steel manufacturing industry goes, it's a center of South African heavy industry. It's linked upstream and downstream hugely into employment. But for the past 10 years, it's been in decline. So it's much smaller than the other countries. It's gone from producing about 10 megatons of primary steel down to about 5 megatons in 10 years. And this analysis shows that it's essentially not competitive in international value chain. So that's the background. As far as plans for the transformation of the industry goes, because of its structural problems, it has no plans. And there are various, the full disclosure project says that the biggest steelmaker, which is a local operation of ArcelorMittal that dominates the industry here, essentially doesn't report on any plans for transformation or plans to reduce emissions. However, that's just how it is from history, and it's quite understandable how the legacy industry is behaving. But it's not all bad news, because if you look at South Africa's iron ore mining, it's dominated by Anglo-American Corporation, the multinational, and Anglo-American does have plans, which it has announced, to decrease emissions, both scope 1 and 2, but very importantly, scope 3 emissions. And in South Africa, its scope 3 emissions are dominated by steel making. So it's, South Africa exports about 80 megatons, most of which is Anglo-American, and that goes into local steel making. And it's said by 2040, it's going to halve its scope 3 emissions. So along with South Africa's very competitive and abundant renewable energy and iron ore, we have the seeds or the potential for a green iron export industry, similar to Sweden, that Max described so well. But that'll be in the rest of the conversation. What will be essential, though, is for South Africa to gain access to lead markets, because quite simply, poor countries aren't going to be buying steel, which is mainly used for construction and infrastructure, at prices much higher than they can import it from China. And just the political economy, it's not realistic to expect poor countries to build everything they have to do. And I'm just going to make one last comment before handing back. Africa has 0.5 tons of in-use steel stocks per capita. The US has about 14, the EU has about 10. And basically you need about 5 tons per capita for basic housing, infrastructure, etc. So Africa's got a huge amount of building with steel to do. And we've got lots of iron. Guinea's got one of the biggest deposits in the world. South Africa's got quite a lot. So for our transformation to happen, we're going to have 2 steps. The first plants will need to access European lead markets, and then building on those, we will build the local green steel industry and hopefully not replace the existing blast furnaces, which are actually very few in Africa, with new ones. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilton. So very interesting. A sector sort of historically in decline, but perhaps actually some opportunity now from this new industry, but conditional on there being sort of the demand pull from Europe and other places to kind of make that happen. Super interesting. Thank you, panelists, for this very interesting overview. Let's now move to the Q&A. I noticed we have several questions already that have been posted by some of our participants. So I might just start by going through some of those and throw to the panelists. So if you'd all stay with your cameras on. Perhaps the first question I might ask is from Krista Friedel, who asks, could you focus on the significance of scrap for greening the steel industry? Is there enough scrap with high quality available? And so what would be the role of scrap in some of your national steel transition scenarios? Vito, would you like to have a first go perhaps at answering that one? Vito, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Ollie, thank you very much. It's an excellent question. What we do see in our work is that the availability of scrap will increase in the future, which is a very important strategy. I've seen studies that project that by 2030 alone, we will have more than 200 to 300 million tons of scrap compared to 2019 levels. At the same time, Hilton just mentioned, we also have a massively rising demand for infrastructure in emerging and developing economies. Now, one of the key issues that was raised in the question was, do we have enough high quality scrap? And I think as of now, the answer is probably no, because there are not enough policies in place that make sure that we have good sorting practices, collection practices, and so on. So currently we're in a world where a lot of the scrap is recycled, or almost all of the scrap is recycled, but if the quality of the scrap is not high, this means that this scrap steel can only be used in infrastructure and construction, but not for other applications to also partially substitute primary steel. If we want to make that happen, we need to have the policies in place that make sure that we ensure a high level of scrap quality. And in fact, we have just done a webinar last week where we talked about the importance of this in the European context. The European Commission just published on Wednesday legislative proposals for the Circular Economy Action Plan, where a lot of these measures are discussed and put on the table. So I think in the EU, we have a good chance that policies will be put in place to make sure that the quality of scrap can be maintained. But I think this is also something that is very, very relevant in the global context. And we hope that other governments will also look into this issue.
Very interesting, Vito. I see we have a question from Robert Paulensteiner as well, who also asks, I think, a relevant question for several of our panelists. How do you ensure the supply of green hydrogen for steel production? I presume he means enough green hydrogen for steel production. Yes, how are these large amounts of electricity going to be produced? I'm not quite sure. There's several people I could throw to here. Perhaps Tim, we could start with you. How would Australia produce large amounts of clean hydrogen?
The 5 largest proposed hydrogen projects in the world, but ultimately transport of hydrogen is still probably a decade away from being commercially viable. Japan in particular is leading the development of that transportation technology, but it is a decade away from commercialization being realistic. So it's interesting, the supply agreement I just referenced between Australia and E.ON in Germany is all about using ammonia, green ammonia, as the vector. And in fact, what E.ON's talking about doing is potentially then reconverting the ammonia back into hydrogen for reinjection into the gas grid of Europe. So that's relatively ineffective, but at the end of the day, Australia is a long way from anywhere and transportation is the key constraint. So it's going to be a lot easier to produce in a place like Spain or France, where ArcelorMittal's talking about doing that, or in Norway or Sweden, where you've got the hydro. In other words, doing it where you don't have to transport the product across the world, because ultimately the efficiency of hydrogen, once you have taken into account transport, is really problematic, and it really challenges all of the economics. So notwithstanding my enthusiasm for the deal that E.ON's just signed, it is going to be a very expensive source of diversification away from Russian gas. I think there will be more optimal solutions on-site manufacturing of green hydrogen.
Right, and maybe also that would be, those transport issues would be an argument for, as you were mentioning before, sort of shifting a bit upstream, or shifting parts of the value chain to where the hydrogen actually is, right? So if Australia has huge amounts of relatively cheap hydrogen and iron ore, then it might make more sense to produce more of the value chain in say, Australia, a bit like the POSCO-Hancock deal, right?
Exactly. That to me is the holy grail, that if we can commercialize green iron, then Australia can play a globally important role. So that would be the #1 option. And that, as Rachel highlighted, we need the policy support, we need the price signal as well, because at the moment, if there's no price signal in Japan or Korea for decarbonise steel, then why would an Australian iron ore producer produce it? And that is ultimately, we need policy. Now, I'm not having a go at Japan and Korea. My country is far more a climate laggard than theirs are, but we need that global consensus. We need for the developed countries to work to solve this global collective problem.
Right. I think thanks, Tim. I think Hilton wanted to come in here too.
Yes, thanks, Ollie. Just to add, we did a fairly detailed study of a typical 1 megaton plant. And what we did with that is it was isolated from the grid because our iron ore is in an area with excellent solar radiation. So we had we priced in a dedicated PV field, a 800 megawatt field to feed the green iron manufacturer. And then we also costed hydrogen storage so that we have continuous production. And yes, it is more expensive than conventional production. So we need that price signal, but it's certainly highly competitive with any other solutions and definitely more competitive than transporting hydrogen.
Right, okay, interesting. But perhaps, so there's different perspectives here, though, I think. So Australia and South Africa may be one sort of end of the spectrum, but I know in countries like Japan and Korea, there is maybe in some circles more skepticism about, the availability of renewables. Could I maybe ask Rachel or you, Rachel, would you go first perhaps to tell us a bit, in practice, is it really a constraint in Korea to produce a green hydrogen for steel, or is this just, the usual resistance to change?
I guess it's an excellent question. In Korea, green hydrogen is, it's a very, very strong concern because we are, like, South Korea is practically we are an isolated country because we are divided and we are a peninsula. So our grid is not, it's totally isolated. And as of 2020, only 4% of the power, the total power generation is powered by renewables. So it means that, in order to produce green hydrogen, we have to install at least 15 to 20 gigawatt of solar or wind per year throughout the 30 years coming 30 coming years. So that's a very big ambitious challenge for us, and but which we think it is very essential, which we think very essential to move toward a net zero economy. But while there's a huge resistance against this, rapid scale up of renewables as well. And also, last month we got a new president elected. So this president-elect is coming from a conservative party. So most likely, conservative party is likely be slower than the progressive one regarding renewable energy scale up. So yes, green hydrogen is a big of a concern, and even though we scale up renewables as rapidly as possible, we still need a big chunk of import of green hydrogen, from neighboring countries like Australia or maybe Southeast Asian countries or China, where renewable energy is much more abundant than us. So.
Right.
According to our analysis, maybe by 2050, even though we start to produce green hydrogen from 2035, the time where we believe offshore wind PV will get commercialized fully in Korea, then still we have to import more than 60% of green hydrogen needed for the country.
Right. So super interesting. I mean, it's a very different perspective. So you have sort of, potentially exporters and importers here of different parts of that spectrum. I mean, I think if I can just add a word here, I think in Europe, our perspective as Agora has also been, it depends also on how much hydrogen you want to produce, right? Because, there are people who would like to use hydrogen for lots of things, not just steel making. There were people who'd like to use it to sort of replace gas in the existing grid so they can basically keep their existing gas assets, etc. And there is a question at some point of, well, what is actually an efficient use of resources here, right? So whether you use it just for steel and ammonia or in certain specific industrial applications on the one hand, or you use it for the whole energy system is sort of, I think, an important dimensioning factor here. Maybe I'm aware of the time. I see we have a question also from Joseph Cordonnier, who asks essentially about the how do companies avoid the sort of loss of competitiveness, because these green steel products will have a green premium associated with them. They'll be a bit more expensive than conventional steel routes. So how do companies manage that green premium? And how can also the impact on end consumers be limited? So will this mean that suddenly our cars will be much, much more expensive, or our buildings? What does that mean? I might ask Max Arman to come in here, since he knows the Swedish companies who seem to think they've solved the problem.
I'm not sure they have, but well, first of all, if you sort of, the amount of steel in a car is not more than 1 ton. If you make it 20-30% more expensive, the cost of buying a car would maybe change with 0.5% or 1%. So in the consumer, at least for some very sort of high-end products, the price for the consumer is negligible. It's not much at all. So I mean, and that of course we've seen the effects of that. There's a lot of car manufacturers, especially, but not only car manufacturers in Sweden, also building companies and things like that, that see a value in actually promoting that they use green steel. So I mean, as far as I've heard, the Hybrid does not have any problems in selling whatever green steel they will produce in 2025. There is definitely a market willing to pay this extra premium for it in Europe, and it's basically based on a lot of awareness among the customers. There is a value. So at least for a specific amount of green steel, there is actually no loss of competitiveness, on the contrary. But then, of course, if you move into the big bulk production of steel, eventually the cost issue will be real for sort of simple rebars and stuff like that. But we're far from that yet. Let's discuss that problem when it arises.
Okay, very interesting, and obviously, I guess, depends on the policy framework too, right? So to the extent that you drive demand through certain policies, whether it's financial support or regulatory requirements, etc., that can affect the competitiveness, I guess, as well. We have a question also, I think, on skills and jobs. So Hilton mentioned that this is an important employer in South Africa. I think Yuko also noted in Japan the steel sector is an important employer in industry. Yuko, can I ask you, as we shift from, say, conventional blast furnace routes to DRI and EAF plants, how might this affect employment in the steel sector? Is it the same skills? Is it different skills? What are the issues there that would need to be tackled in a country like Japan?
Yeah, that's really a big question, because that we haven't yet, or the steel makers haven't yet decided which way is really effective to import the DRI or to produce that in Japan. So that is really highly related to the cost for the green hydrogen and the renewable electricity. And it's really, we actually, as a renewable energy institute, we don't have the different view on this. Maybe with the other steel companies. The steel companies are thinking that they can, they are saying that they still really keep the job here in Japan. But the reality is we have experienced a lot in our history that the companies are really footloose, so they can easily move to the upload to produce the green steel, for example, in Australia or in South Africa. So that's important thing is how we can keep the job for the domestic production with secondary steel. So we are really looking at the fully, how to utilize a fully, how to utilize the potential of the secondary steel fully, and to make the for example, scrap industry more modernized, and to make the demand for the secondary steel by the not only the government but the private procurement. So those things are really important to keep the jobs. Yeah, because the Japan is really exporting a lot of steel products. So part of the manufacturing process may be or probably go away from Japan, but still we can keep the job with some kind of production, especially utilizing the secondary steel, I think.
Thank you very much, Yuka. So I'm aware we have 1 minute left before the close of our side event, so I actually need to wrap up now. It strikes me though, just as in concluding remarks, it strikes me a couple of things. One is that actually there are enormous economic opportunities here, right? So when we talk about, for example, closing coal plants, everyone focuses on the negative sort of economic aspect of this, but for a number of countries, there are enormous opportunities. But what's missing in a way is sort of the policy framework and the leadership from policymakers to actually kind of harness this opportunity and to accelerate the transition. The other thing that strikes me is frankly the very big difference between the levels of ambition between some of your different countries, or even with individual companies in an individual country, you know, and so it does seem as if some actors have sort of woken up or have a view that actually the future could change very quickly, and they need to prepare for it. Others seem much more skeptical, and you know it will be interesting to see, you know, who is right on this. As Vito notes, however, or as several of you noted, it's a big risk, right, to wait, because if you reinvest for 20 years into old technology, that's a very expensive mistake. So I think the analysis that Vito presented actually seems to my mind anyway to make sense, especially when you consider, you know, things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, climate clubs, steel breakthroughs. You know, the future could actually look very, very different all of a sudden in some point in the next 10 years. Okay, we're 1 minute over time, so I should probably stop talking and wrap up. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. Thanks very much for this really excellent discussion. I've learned a lot, and I hope the audience has too. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Nicola to close the workshop.
Yes, thank you very much also from my side, dear panelists, and also for the audience for bearing with us. And with that, I wave goodbye to everyone on the panel, to the audience, and I will be closing the room shortly to open the next one for the next webinar. Have a good rest of the day, night, wherever you are, in which time zone you are, and enjoy the weekend. Bye.